All right. So today we are going to review for quiz four. And quiz four deals with the fallacies of reasoning, which are errors that we make when we're giving speeches or writing papers. But in this case, we're focusing in on people giving speeches or engaged in debates where they make mistakes in terms of logic. Sometimes this is done accidentally. Sometimes this is done on purpose. It's helpful to study it because if you're an audience member, you want to be able to notice when people have made mistakes so they don't persuade you to do something or think something that you don't really want to think or do. And as a speaker, you want to try to avoid these for the most part, for moral reasons, but also just so that people can't quickly point out that you've made a error and then as a result of that, negate your point. Again, these are the fallacies of reasoning, and they are errors in logic. So we're going to go over the different fallacies that are pointed out in your textbooks. All right, the first one is known as the false cause. This is a fallacy that assumes that one thing causes another, but there is no logical connection between the two. An example of this is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a news story about people eating bats in China, and at the same time there was news about the perhaps, and this is debatable, the origin of the coronavirus being in China. Um, well, let's just assume for the sake of argument that the coronavirus originated in China. That's just for the sake of argument, because that's very debatable. But let's say that it did originate there. It doesn't necessarily mean that eating bats caused it. It's just that that was happening at the same time. So this is also known as mistaking correlation for cause, because at the same time that people were eating bats, which some subcultures do and have done for many years, um, it doesn't mean that the bat eating is causing it. And some people argue that bats carry a lot of diseases. Well, maybe according to who, a lot compared to what, pigs or, because pigs are known to be filthy animals according to some people's beliefs, and some people call them swine. Mm, what can we eat and what can't we eat? Maybe that's a little bit of ethnocentrism on the judgment of eating bats, and there really is no connection between eating bats and the coronavirus, and they're just completely unrelated. But people believed it was true, and there were even some attacks on Asian Americans because of this, weirdly. Um, and Donald Trump referred to it as Kung flu, which is basically almost a racial slur, or is a racial slur. So that was a problem that happened too, as a result of this false cause error that was made. Another example of this would be the Central Park 5 or Central Park Jogger incident. This is where in 1989, a jogger was jogging in Central Park in New York and was attacked. At the same time, the police picked up a group of five African American teenagers. Um, so they were in the same park at the same time, but the African American teenagers didn't actually commit the crime, and this was proven with DNA evidence years later. Nevertheless, they spent time not only in jail but in prison for that crime that they did not commit. And this was another example of mistaken correlation for cause or false cause. And actually, during the time, Donald Trump took out full page ad in the newspaper in New York asking for the teenagers to receive the death penalty. So you can see how some bad things happen as a result of the false cause fallacy. Just because two things are happening at the same time, even in the same area, which, Central Park's a pretty big park. It's square footage wise, I don't think it's as big as Golden Gate Park, but it's a fairly large park. There can be two things happening, three things happening in the same park. It doesn't mean that they caused each other in any way. So that's another example of the false cause. The next one is known as the slippery slope fallacy, which is also known as the domino theory. This is a type of false cause which assumes that taking a first step will lead to subsequent events that cannot be prevented. And this is typically like, one bad thing's going to happen and it's going to lead to another bad thing, which is going to lead to another bad thing. And that sort of flows into our brains as human beings and sort of buys into some paranoia that we might have, but there might not be any relationship, and it's not necessarily the case that that's going to really happen. An example of this would be the Vietnam War. People were concerned that this is in the 1960s and early 70s, that if and actually in the 50s a little bit as well, that people were concerned that if communism spread out through the country of Vietnam, it would spread throughout Asia and then eventually spread to the entire world. And never really stopping to ask if communism, if it was actually practiced accurately, was a bad thing. But also, assuming it is a bad thing just for the sake of argument, would it really spread that way? Um, so this argument is sometimes used with like gateway drugs. They say, if a person has a drink of alcohol, that'll lead to them smoking pot, which will lead to them trying ecstasy and acid, and that'll lead to opioids and heroin, and eventually crack or cocaine, or methamphetamines. This idea, this pattern that it just starts with one drink. And while that can happen occasionally, it doesn't necessarily going to happen, and it really depends on the individual. That's another example of the slippery slope fallacy, also known as the domino theory. And there's another example is people are worried that if young children are exposed to drag queens reading children's stories in libraries, that will lead them to want to become drag queens themselves, want to become transgender, maybe turn gay, um, which of course people don't turn gay. As Lady Gaga has pointed out, we are born this way. Um, so yeah, that's another fallacy and that's used to justify that not allowing uh, drag queens to read to children in libraries, or be exposed to children. And actually, also, it just kind of begs the question: is there anything wrong with being a drag queen or a transgender person or being gay? But let's assume that those things, are what they are. One isn't going to lead to the other the way that people have outlined it. And here we have an example of a drag queen, Alaska Thunder. The next one is known as the hasty generalization. This is the situation where basically it's making a generalization with too few examples. Donald Trump does this all the time. He'll tell a story or two about a few immigrants who have committed a crime and then make generalizations about immigrants in general. And his favorite target, of course, is immigrants from Mexico, especially. So that's a fallacy. A few specific examples uh, cannot be used to make a big generalization. It misses the point that there are like literally millions of immigrants that commit no crimes whatsoever, um, and pay taxes and are good members of society, etc. Next up, we have the straw person fallacy. This is the fallacy that shows only the weaker side of an opponent's argument in order to more easily tear it down. Also, what sometimes happens with this is that sometimes people say someone said something that they didn't really actually say. So that can happen too. And this is also a time when people sometimes pick the most hot button or contested or debatable or the one that gets the most emotion going part of a bigger argument and a bigger stance and uses that to try to tear down the opponent's argument or just tear down the opponent in general. An example of this would be Riley Gaines. Riley Gaines is a sort of an anti-trans conservative speaker. She's also a swimmer, and she speaks out against transgender athletes. A lot of people have grabbed her arguments and her persona and used it to attack the transgender rights movement in general, when in fact, transgender athletes is only one small sliver of the entire transgender debate. Also, the number of transgender athletes is very small as well. So to make that the whole of the discussion about transgender rights is the issue. And that's not to say that there's anything necessarily wrong with transgender athletes, but transgender athletes are the part of the discussion that tend to be the most emotional for people and the most hot button issues around it. And it tends to cause the most extreme reactions. So to reduce the entire thing to that is a good example of a straw person argument. And actually, Riley Gaines, she was scheduled to speak at San Francisco State University. And at the time, I was a teacher there, and they asked me to cancel my classes because they were worried that she was going to cause a riot. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this whole thing. I didn't end up having to cancel my class incidentally because I figured out my class was way in the speaker, Riley Gaines, was going to speak way in the afternoon, and my class was early in the morning, so it didn't make sense. All right. Um, Other example sort of this is the Aziz Ansari case. Aziz Ansari is a comedian, and basically what happened with that was that he was accused of violating proper behavior, and there was an effort made to cancel him. So this relates back to the Me Too movement, which was a legitimate movement, very important, very many good examples of it. However, the example of Aziz Ansari was sort of a shaky example, and it was used by people who are against the Me Too movement to try to discredit the entire movement. Basically, with the Aziz Ansari case, he went out to dinner with a woman. During dinner, he recommended she have white wine rather than red wine with her fish. Um, so that was the first thing. Um, and then I believe they went back to his apartment and he tried to kiss her. Uh, and she said she wasn't interested and she wanted to go home. And so he called her, uh, this is his version of the story anyway. He called her an Uber. Um, Basically, that's her version of the story. A few small details as well are different. So it just sort of, a lot of people looked at that as sort of being an example of a bad date. Rather than the Me Too movement, but people who are against the Me Too movement really emphasize this situation. And they particularly emphasize the part about the wine is the thing. They sort of overlooked the attempted kiss and the Uber ride home. That part of it wasn't looked at as much. Maybe there was some, violation there, But the white wine thing might have just been rude for him to, sort of be mansplaining what kind of wine you're supposed to have or whatever. But it didn't really qualify as Me Too per se. It's in any case, it's a very debatable situation. What actually happened that night? Neither of us, obviously only Aziz Ansari and his date Eve were even there, so nobody knows what exactly happened. Um, and it might have even been an example of inappropriate behavior, but compared to some of the other Me Too examples, to put so much emphasis on this particular example is where the straw person argument comes in because you're really focusing in on one of the kind of more debatable, more gray area examples and overlooking then as a result of that some of the, more extreme versions of Me Too where, with Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein and that kind of thing. So, uh, yeah, it arguably could be considered kind of a straw man argument. And again, not necessarily knowing exactly what happened in the situation. The straw person argument, part of it was really the emphasis in the story, in the headlines, that about the white wine versus the red wine thing. So that made the Me Too movement look bad unnecessarily. Um, yeah, so that was kind of what happened there. And then also the other thing is I think the website that initially appeared on didn't stay open for very long, but then the story had gotten picked up by other people, so that was just another element of the whole thing. It was just probably given more attention than it really deserved, and it's a good example of how we see the straw person argument come in. Next up, we have the false dilemma. This is when people tell you that there are two choices when in fact there are more than two, often referred to as the either or fallacy. When you are given only two options and more than two options exist, that is a false dilemma. So the classic example is like you have to be, a Democrat or Republican, and you have to vote Democrat or Republican, overlooking all the other parties and independent candidates that are out there. Um, People sometimes do this too in like interpersonal relationships. They'll give you an ultimatum, like you have to go out with them that particular night or else they're going to break up with you, overlooking the third possibility that you might not go out that night, but go out the next night, but if you haven't seen each other for a while and someone's really wanting to see someone else, they might give the other person an ultimatum, which can play itself out in terms of a false dilemma where things are just, one way or the other. And in fact, there are more than two choices. Also, sometimes with this, you get like a situation where people present things as if there's two good choices, and then you pick between the two, but in fact, one of the choices is so bad that it's just a way for them to con you into picking the other choice, not considering all the other choices that are there. The classic example of this would be if someone goes to like a mattress store and they have you first lie on one mattress and then it feels terrible and it's very uncomfortable and there's springs poking you, and then you lie on another mattress and it feels good. And then they give you kind of the choice of those two mattresses when in fact they have other mattresses in the store, or certainly there are other mattresses at other mattress stores. And in fact, like the extreme version of that is that the mattress salesman is not very scrupulous and actually like has no intention of actually selling you the first mattress. It's that mattress is only there and was manufactured to feel bad, um, as a way to push you towards the other mattress, and then not consider all the other mattresses just because that first one was so bad. But they don't really plan to sell that mattress to anyone. It's just there as an example of what not to buy. Um, and it's to push them in the direction of the other ones after, they get this extreme feeling of comfort after that terrible spring hit them in the back, and you know, and then they say, "Hey, which one of these two mattresses do you want?" And it's like, well, yeah, but there are more than two mattresses certainly out there. Maybe this store only sells two types of mattresses. I don't know if that's the case, but there are many mattress stores, especially on President's Weekend, that you can choose from. The false dilemma. The next one is known as the appeal to tradition. This is where we are given a situation where it seems like the reason we were supposed to do it is because people have done it in the past that way, and it's a tradition. Um, so it's the argument that we've always done it this way. The thing about it is that some traditions can be sexist, can buy into the patriarchy, can be racist, can be discriminatory, can be ableist. So just because something is a tradition and has been done in the past doesn't mean it's actually a good thing. And the classic example of this is the comedic musical Fiddler on the Roof, where the main character Tevye wants his daughters to marry whoever the town matchmaker says they should marry, and they want to marry for love. Um, and when they ask him like why, like they have to marry who the matchmaker says instead of just marrying who they want to marry or who they want to marry for love, he says tradition. He has a song called Tradition. So that's a sort of a comedic way to sort of present what a fallacy this is. Just because we've done something in the past doesn't mean it's a good thing. And sometimes people will use, like in this modern era, people use also sometimes the term past practice, because just because something was done by in the past doesn't make it good, but they'll say, oh, well, it's past practice and make that seem like a good idea. But really, we have to look at whether or not these things are good or not. Now, some traditions are fine. You can wear green on St. Patrick's Day and it's probably not going to hurt anybody. But um, there are some traditions that are outdated, and we frankly just don't need to keep doing them just because they were done in the past. And so, because traditionally, like women couldn't vote, and traditionally we had slavery and all sorts of things. Let's look at this one. Here's this example of something that's, outdated. Lotus shoes in China, which were very painful and, make it hard for women to run away from danger. Um, there's all kinds of issues with these shoes, and so this practice is not practiced anymore, even though the shoes themselves can be, found in museums and stuff like that. That the practice of lotus shoes or foot binding is, not practiced anymore, or at least not practiced widely, and usually is illegal in most regions. So just because something's a tradition doesn't mean we have to keep on doing it. The next one is the bandwagon fallacy. This is a fallacy that asserts that because something is popular or seems to be, it is therefore good, correct, or desirable. So it's kind of the classic argument like everybody's doing it. Come on, mom, everybody's doing it. And here I have Cheech and Chong, a picture of them. They're comedians that sort of made fun of drugs and drug culture. Um, and they really got into this sometimes with some of their routines about this idea that, we should do drugs just because everybody else is doing them, without looking at like the danger involved. And of course, today in the modern era, a pill that might be labeled ecstasy could have fentanyl in it and could be deadly. So, just because everybody else is doing something doesn't mean it's necessarily a good idea. This is not exactly what people refer to when they're referring to best practices at work, but sometimes you'll hear things about best practice. And sometimes if you drill down, you'll find out that people consider something to be a best practice because everybody's doing it. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't make it a good thing necessarily. Sometimes people do bad things. A whole bunch of people do bad things. It doesn't make it worth doing. And the next one is known as the red herring. This is an irrelevant issue that's introduced into a controversy to divert attention away from the real controversy. It creates a diversion or introducing an irrelevant point to distract someone or get someone off the subject of the argument. Um, Sort of a classic example of this that we've been hearing lately is the idea that perhaps Donald Trump chose to go to war against Iran to distract from the Epstein files case. Um, there are other examples, like you could have examples of this is like when you're having roommates, you might be trying to discuss with them the dishes, dirty dishes in the sink, and then they change the subject to the electricity bill to try to distract you. So that could happen too. Originally, the term red herring comes from the practice of what they would do is sometimes they would drag a red herring, which is a type of fish, a smoked fish, across the trail and it has a strong scent, and it would throw off the scent of the hunting dogs. So that was the idea. So a red herring is a type of smoked fish. And example of a red herring, in this case, this is Al Gore, who was running for president against George W. Bush in 1999. And during the debate, they were discussing affirmative action. And in order to treat everybody equally, sometimes you have to treat some people differently, and was the basis of affirmative action programs. Affirmative action programs in college admissions always required that the students meet the minimum requirements, and typically there were no quotas. Uh, but George W. Bush said that he was against affirmative action programs because they involved quotas and that sometimes you would allow people into a university that were not meeting the minimum qualifications. But in fact, and Al Gore pointed that out, that's a red herring because basically you're talking about a type of program that is not actually practiced. And you're just trying to distract people away from the real discussion about the merits of affirmative action. Because affirmative action programs at the time did not involve quotas and minimum standards were not overlooked during the admissions process. So it was just kind of a red herring thrown in there to distract people away. And Al Gore actually used the word red herring during the debate. Next up, we have the ad hominem attack. This is a fallacy that attacks the person rather than dealing with the real issue or dispute. Connects a real or perceived flaw in a person's character or behavior to an issue he or she supports, asserting that the flaw in character makes the position on the issue wrong. And here we have Michael Moore, who made a lot of good sort of left-wing documentaries like Bowling for Columbine, which deals with gun control issues in the United States and just guns in general. And also Fahrenheit 9/11, which calls into question the second Gulf War um, in Iraq. And basically, I was discussing Michael Moore's films with one of my conservative friends, and she said that he's overweight. First off, there's nothing wrong with necessarily being overweight, and also his weight is sort of irrelevant. So you could say that's like a red herring, but in this case, we call it an ad hominem attack because it's attacking the person rather than dealing with the real issue in the dispute. So it's a, I guess you could say it's a particular type of fallacy that sort of resembles the red herring, but it's a little different because you're attacking the person rather than dealing with the real issue or dispute. Misplaced authority is where we give authority to someone who doesn't really deserve authority. In this case, the example here is Jenny McCarthy, who is a good stand-up comedian and a model, and also a announcer for MTV. But because she had an autistic child, she was presented on the Oprah Winfrey Show as being a expert on autism and the connection between autism and vaccines, which has been widely disputed and widely disproven. Nevertheless, she was sort of presented on the show as being an expert because she had an autistic child, but just because you have an autistic child doesn't mean you're an expert on vaccines and the alleged connection between vaccines and autism, which has been actually disproven many, many times. And in fact, the Scottish scientist that tried to form a connection between those two was disproven and lost his funding and disgraced, etc. The good news is that Jenny McCarthy did come back onto the Oprah Winfrey Show a few years later and said that she understood, after having researched it more carefully, that there is no connection between autism and vaccines. It's just that vaccines happen to take place around the same time doctors sort of start to detect autism, but the two aren't necessarily causal. So that's an example of misplaced authority because Jenny McCarthy, rather than having a doctor on who might be an expert, Oprah Winfrey had Jenny McCarthy on as an expert on autism and vaccines. The next one is the non sequitur. This is also known as it does not follow. This is where you say two things together, but they don't really make sense together. They don't really relate, but if you keep repeating it over and over again and it sounds good, people start to accept the argument. So a good example of this is we're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it, which implies that we should build the wall between the United States and Mexico because Mexico is going to pay for it. And this was repeated over and over again by Donald Trump in his first term in office when he was running for office. And it just was repeated over and over and over and over again until people started to accept it. And if you really think about it, like they're not connected. Like we shouldn't build the wall just because Mexico's going to pay for it. And also, Mexico is not going to pay for the wall. Mexico doesn't have extra money or, that they can use to pay for a wall. So that's just not happening. So there you go. There's another example of something that is a non sequitur. And also, it kind of ignores the debate about whether or not it's a good idea to build the wall in the first place. Like, even if Mexico was willing to build it, pay for it, which is very unlikely or impossible, uh, it seems like, you have to look at whether the wall is a good thing in the first place, in the original case. But if people just keep repeating over and over and over again, we're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. We're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. We're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. It starts to making sense in people's heads sometimes, but in fact, it's a fallacy of reasoning and it's a non sequitur. So those were our fallacies this time around. Hope you have fun studying for the quiz and looking at the fallacies. And again, you can read about those in your textbooks as well. And good luck on the quiz. Thanks so much.